We are live. Hello, Anastasia. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, thanks for having me on your channel.
Welcome to the channel. Oh, sure. Yeah, I've been really looking forward to this. It's going to be great.
Okay.
I have my notes here, so if I'm looking down, that's what I'm doing. I'm looking at my notes.
Oh, perfect.
So, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing awesome. Yeah. I mean, I'm not enjoying this super duper cold weather we're having lately, but it's beautiful outside at least.
Yeah, right. I'm a cold weather chicken, so yeah. I'm not the person to ask, but I used to love winter when I was a kid. It's just I have to tune to that. When the snow comes down and my kids are so excited about it, I'm like, yeah.
Well,
be like that. It's somewhere in there.
Yeah, we like to kind of live a second childhood through our children, right?
Yeah, I think it's good. It really helps me.
Yeah, my crazy kids will just run out without any coat, or I mean, lately my daughter ran out there without shoes, and I'm just sitting here like, what are you doing?
Oh, I always had to do that at least once every winter. Just feel that snow on my face, see if I could get sick or something.
Oh boy. Who knows? Maybe it's good for them. We just don't know it.
Maybe. Oh, man. Okay, so let's dig into your story today. So I understand you're now attending a diocesan parish, but you've had quite a journey before getting there. So you were raised within traditional circles like the SSPV and the SSPX. And I'm wondering if you'd mind telling us a little bit about your childhood and what it was like for you growing up in the environment of Sedevacantism. That was until you were like 13, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure. What's interesting about the fact that I was raised going to the SSPV, which stands for the Society of St. Pius V, and they're a break off of the original, Society of St. Pius X. I think they broke off around 1983 or so. And I was born in 85. So just a few years before I was born. But what was interesting is that my parents were not Sedevacanists. The only reason we were attending the mission chapel until I was 10, and then the bigger parish until I was 13, was because of location. And they said the TLM, and it just didn't really bother my dad that they were Sedevacanists, so to speak. So, yeah. So we weren't taught that the Pope was not the Pope. My parents still believed the Pope was the Pope, but that he was wicked, evil, a modernist, you name it.
Yeah.
And every bad thing out there was the Pope.
Yeah.
These popes, starting with Paul VI and John the 23rd and JP2 were all considered very wicked men. That's what I was raised with. So my childhood, I was baptized, by an SSPV priest, and for the first 10 years, it was a great childhood. I loved. We had a loving family. We lived out in the country, and it was all normal for me. Like going to mass. We had what was called like a mission chapel, and so we had mass every other week. I think different missions. Some of them had them every week, but we didn't. And so the one Sunday we would go to mass, and then the following Sunday, we would stay home and we would say, my dad would, read the epistle and the gospel for the day, for the Sunday, and we would say the family rosary. And then we would just, go hang out at grandma's place for the rest of the day. And so that was normal for me. I knew that, for example, my cousins who lived across the field from us, they were Novus Ordo. And so they went, they went to mass every Sunday. They went to the local parish in our town. And so I did know that. But I just didn't, I just didn't think much of it as a child. It was, we were different, but we were both Catholic. And then at 10 years old, my mom and dad decided to move to the bigger parish. I don't even know. I don't think you can call it a parish, but that's what we call it. And that was, probably about 4 hours from where I grew up. And so we moved there, and my siblings and I were put in the grade school that they had there at the time. And, other than a few so we had mass every Sunday then, and during the week as well. And there were some strange things that I started to realize in those 3 years, but it was just more things that were happening at the parish. Like, for example, the priest was very harsh with anybody who, if for example, if he found out that they had gone to mass anywhere else, if they had gone to mass at the CMRI, which is another Sedevacanist group, or that seemed to be a really big one, the CMRI, and I'm not sure if there was like a priest that came through that area that would say mass there or something. I'm not sure why. If you went to the SSPX, and so he would from the pulpit basically call out these people's names. And I remember that being a big deal because it would just really irritate my parents. It was so wrong. He would refuse them communion. He would call them out from the pulpit, and he would say, "I'm going to refuse you communion." And I specifically remember a couple times when this one family went up there, and he literally did. He just refused them, and they stayed there over and over and over, like throughout the times that he would go back and be giving the Eucharist to everybody.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And so, yeah, there was a lot of
that's like shaming. It makes you wonder why they came back.
It was. I know. Well, and actually I think they did end up leaving. But anyway, long story short, so other than things like that, at the very end of those 3 years, the reason that we moved again was because my dad I don't remember dates and stuff like that, because it was just like I was a little kid and I was just hearing this stuff. But essentially, my dad had a problem with the fact that the SSPV had consecrated or had one of their priests, Father Clarence Kelly was his name, consecrated a bishop by a Novus Ordo bishop in California. And I think his name was Bishop Mendez. And so basically they had hid it from the faithful for a couple of years that they had consecrated this bishop. And so when everybody started finding out about it, my dad was like, "Why was this done in secret? What's the problem?" And apparently they had pictures of it and that sort of thing, but it was just weird to him and not okay that this had been kept a secret from the faithful. And it's funny because I think he was like, this isn't how the church works. And that sort of thing. And so the priest essentially got mad at my dad, and he said, "Hey, you know what? Keep your mouth shut about this. And if you can't keep your mouth shut, then you can leave." And so my dad decided to leave. And so then that's when we ended up moving over to kind of like a mega SSPX parish.
Okay.
Which is just one of their bigger parishes, like one of their biggest parishes, I should say, because there's like in the United States, I don't know how many there are now, probably more like five bigger parishes, but at the time there were two main ones.
Okay.
And so we moved there, and and then that's when I was getting older, so I was starting to pay more attention to things happening and going on. And that was a sad move for me as a 13-year-old, because I left all of my friends that I had to leave behind. And it was hard to make friends at 13, at least for me, especially because this particular parish seemed to be quite cliquey. If you weren't in the parish and people didn't know you, you weren't really, accepted or welcomed. At least the kids. Maybe my parents felt differently. They never really told me. But this is just my experience. And then they put my brothers in the boys' school, and my mom ended up just keeping us at home, the girls at home, and homeschooling. They did have a Dominican girls' school there, but she just didn't. I'm not sure why she didn't send us. I know that she really didn't believe in their philosophy. Partly, they wanted people to send their 3-year-olds to them so they could basically like train them and raise them. And mom's like, that's my job. So
yeah, interesting.
Yeah. And then later, like as the years went on, she realized that she made a good decision, because there were a lot of girls that would just come out of the Dominicans because it was so harsh. It was too harsh. They'd be losing their hair and get really sick.
Wow.
And so it was pretty strict and stringent, and some girls did really good with that, and others did not at all do well. So and so then I lived there until I was 18. And then I was looking at religious vocation, and there were not very many convents to pick from, right? Because I was in the SSPX. There was like the SSPX. And then and then there were sort of like the Dominicans, which not technically SSPX. Honestly, I don't even know like if they're in the church, because they have the SSPX priests say mass for them. So I'm assuming not. I'm not sure what branch they come from in France.
Okay.
And then there were the Franciscans. But anyway, I was looking specifically at the SSPX convent. And so I was in contact with the Mother Superior at the time, and we were writing letters back and forward, and she wanted me to get a job teaching in the SSPX before I joined. And so I was looking into that, and where I was living at the time, they weren't hiring, and I didn't feel, super qualified to teach anyway. I was a homeschooled girl, and I got my GED.
That's good.
So then they said, well, you could be a helper in a school. So then I looked at the other sort of mega parish, and they didn't need anybody to teach, but there were a lot of little mission chapels, or even like just places where they would get like every Sunday they would have mass. So I guess you would consider those their mission chapels. And then a priest would come out of a more a bigger parish or the seminary or something to come fly over and say mass. And so I ended up getting a job in just like one of those small little mission schools.
Okay.
And I loved it. I really did. I had 6 little kids that year, 3rd and 4th grade, three in the 3rd, 3 in the 4th. And they were sweet. They were, their families were just good old country folk out in the Midwest. And it was a good experience. It was a lonely year because I didn't know anybody out there. And then after that year, I was told, it literally took the Mother Superior 2 weeks to tell me that, you don't have a religious vocation. You need to go find a husband.
So I'm glad it's obvious to somebody.
So that was kind of funny. I mean, it was interesting. I was like, wow, I'm glad that I found out so quickly, because, I had been writing her for years. And then when I finally went to the convent, and I was planning on staying there all summer, actually. Mm-hmm. And within the first week, I got really sick. And then, like the one walk, I was able to get out and go walk, and then I got a tick on me, and that caused a lot of problems. And so it's just like
one convent that I was discerning with, but it was in Nebraska. And when I went, I'd never like even seen a tick before, and I got one in my leg, and I was just like, ticks! And then I went to go to bed one night, and I pulled back the covers, and there was one on my pillow, and I was like,
No way! Oh my! Wow, it's a sign. It's a sign from God. Oh goodness. Yeah. And so it was just miserable. Literally the 2 weeks, I'd been dreaming for years, of becoming a nun, and within 2 weeks she's just like, no. And so I was glad I wasn't one of those gals that goes and 7 years later realizes that she doesn't have a vocation. So I found out quickly. And so then at that point, my cousin was working at an SSPX school, and she was actually going to enter the Dominican convent. And so she just called up one day and said, "Hey, I told the priest here that he said that if I was going to leave, I had to replace replace myself with a teacher. And so I was calling to see if you'd be interested." And I said yes, because it was going to be closer to my parents, and it didn't feel so far away. And I figured I wouldn't be as lonely.
Yeah.
And it happened to be, close to the ocean too. And I never lived close to the ocean. So I took her up on that. So yeah, so that was,
so
that's
2
when I
years of
moved.
teaching? Is that how it ended up being?
Well, and yeah, and before that I had actually been teaching music, where, at the parish that I grew up in. So I was teaching there, just music. And then I went out to the Midwest and taught there 1 year. And then I actually taught 2 years at the following parish that I went to. Yeah. And so I saw a lot. I saw a lot of, how they dealt with situations in the schools. And suffice it to say that after teaching in their schools, I was not going to send my children to their schools.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, I ended up, meeting my husband the first year, my future husband, the first year that I taught then on the coast. And we were married the second year, and so I taught that second year, most of the year through. I ended up getting pregnant and very, very sick with my first pregnancy, and so it was rough. It was rough to go into school every day, and those poor kids had to deal with me throwing up in the garbage can.
Oh no! Oh.
Yeah, so anyway, it wasn't ideal. And but they were sweet kids. They just, they would ask, "Are you okay?" Yeah, they were sweet. I always had, the little kids, and they were always just so wonderful.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that was after that year. Then I, just became a mother, and I started raising my family, and we were still, never questioning really anything. There were oftentimes things would come up in the school or in the parish, and I had a really good friend down there on the coast, and she and I would talk about it, and it's like, well, that's really weird, and that doesn't seem right, or, but we could always sort of brush it off, and I really never did question, for the most part. There were a couple times in my youth where it was very obvious that we were different, right, than the rest of the Catholics, and we really did feel elitist. At least I did. I know I did, and I know that people all around me did. We felt that we were the remnant, and that all these poor people that went to the Novus Ordo Mass were a bunch of modernists. I mean, poor souls, they were just probably not going to be saved. And so and in fact, that sort of elitist attitude, the superiority complex, did start to bother me later on, because I would read about the church and church history, and one of the books that I loved growing up was The Story of the Church. It was basically like a textbook. I think I read it first in 8th grade. It was by Reverend George Johnson. Anyway, and in there, they talked about how Christians, you could tell a Christian by how they loved one another. And I never felt that. I was, there was a lot of judgment, a lot of condescension, this elitist attitude, which was like just totally arrogant, right? And it's like, boy, I don't know if this is right, you know. And so I just would think about it on a simple level, because I'm just a simple person, you know. I'm not you know, I'm not a theologian or a lawyer, and so I would just think of the things in simple terms. And so certain things would bother me, like, you know, when I read like you know, or heard in the gospel that quote about, you know, God, that God told us that he would never abandon his church. You know, he said to Peter, you know, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I'm like, okay, but he was talking to Peter, who he then made the Pope. And so we believe the Pope is the Pope, but we're really not under the Pope because we're not obeying him. And
but that's just a technicality, Anastasia. Oh, that's not essential to being Catholic. I'm so bad. Oh man, we both just heard that so many times. Only disobedience.
Well, I mean, we really did think that way. Well, you know, the thing is, you didn't. Okay, so what you were told was like, there's a crisis in the church. There's, you know, this is a time of necessity, and so we were given the line, you know, supply jurisdiction. We have supply jurisdiction because we have to save souls. You know, we're the ones, like, as if that the traditional liturgy, the TLM, the 1962 liturgy, was people's salvation. You know. And at the time, of course, I bought into it totally because my parents did. And my parents were way smarter than me. And so I didn't really question that. And I wanted to save my soul. And so it was just easy to kind of sort of stay in line with that because, well, the TLM, I mean, look at the difference. Look at, you know, they have clown masses over here. And it's interesting because now that I've come into the church, I mean, I realized that the clown masses were sort of like, you know, a unicorn mass. Like they weren't that common. I used to think that if you went to Novus Ordo, it would probably most likely be a clown mass or a polka mass, or, you know, something like you were bound to run into that, right? Yeah. And and the thought of even well, and the thought of going into a Novus Ordo parish or a church where they said the Novus Ordo mass, it was just, you didn't even think of it. You know, it was like if you passed a Catholic church, and it was like this beautiful church, you didn't dare go inside, you know, because most likely Jesus wasn't there anyway. And you know, there were just atrocities that happened every single Sunday on those altars, you know. And so yeah, it's really sad now that I think of it, how I mean, really the way I have to look at it is that, like, my life was a life of lies, because they lied to us, and we missed out on a lot of richness and essentially 60 years of teachings from the Catholic Church, because anything from Paul VI onward was poison, and you didn't have to listen, and you didn't have to obey it. And so anyway, and I'm sure, you know, maybe different kids were raised different ways, you know. Like I said, I had a friend, and she's older than I am, but her dad, he questioned things in the Catholic Church, but also when Archbishop Lefebvre ended up defying and disobeying the Pope, essentially, in consecrating the bishops, she said that he was like, oh, this is not good, you know, this is not good. He just got himself excommunicated. And so he was really disappointed in Archbishop Lefebvre. So there were people that had more knowledge, that taught their children, like, no, you know, they still kind of, I think, fell into the whole, well, it's a case of necessity, but at least they respected the papacy to a different degree, to a better degree, you know. I think that there's definitely degrees in the SSPX.
Well, it seems like Protestantism, where everybody's sort of their own unit, even though they sort of ascribe to similar things, they go to the same church, but it's like everybody's in a different place with everything. A little
Sure. Yeah, I would have to agree with that. Yeah. No, it is. I mean, it's very similar to Protestantism. Archbishop Lefebvre is very similar to Martin Luther in the things that he said in his writings, in all of that. And I realize that now. Back then, of course, I would have never said such a thing because, Marcel Lefebvre was a saint in our mind. I remember actually having a picture of him in my room, like venerating him as a saint almost.
Well,
I wouldn't pray. Actually, I would actually pray to him, because there was like this little prayer card that the society put out. Boy, I don't know what year, probably right after his death. And so it was like a prayer card, and it was like this prayer. We prayed that for his canonization.
Oh yeah.
I should see if I still have that prayer card.
Oh man. No.
But anyway,
gosh.
Yeah. Needless to say, the framed picture of him is no more. But anyway, yeah. So that I'm trying to think, like, there's so much, and there's so many rabbit holes I could go down. But that's kind of a quick review of.
Yeah, you're growing up to adult.
At least up until I was early. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Right.
So
your parents moved. They moved because of the churches, basically, and then your dad just found work, or was it like they moved for other reasons, and then it was like, oh, well, let's just move here because there's a church that we can go to?
Yeah, no, it was always they moved because of the churches. Yeah.
Okay.
In fact,
it's amazing to me when people will do that. I mean, I think it's great. Like if you feel like that's what you need to do, but it's funny to me how when it comes to finding a good Novus Ordo, more traditional Catholics tend to be like, oh, but there's nothing in my area. And I'm like, wait, you're willing to drive like 2 hours every Sunday one way to go to a TLM, but you're not willing to drive that far to go to a good Novus Ordo? Like,
right. Interesting. Yeah, no. In fact, I feel like we were told growing up that Dad, he put a lot of things aside that he could have had, like, financial things that he could have bettered himself with to go to big parishes and make sure that we always had a TLM to go to. And so, my parents, God bless them, they always did what, like, the best that they knew how for us, Obviously, if they would have thought the way that I do now, they wouldn't have been moving us to these parishes.
Yeah.
And so I try to just always keep that in mind.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, sorry.
What did you say?
But like, I get what you're saying. Like, according to what they understood at the time, what they believed, they were acting by their convictions and like even sacrificing a lot to do that. I mean, that in itself is a good example, even if what they actually did was misdirected. For sure. Yeah. And that's exactly what they did. And as we've kind of, like, some of their kids have slowly been doing more research and coming out of it, it's been really, really hard for them because they still hold on to a lot of those convictions. And it's like they cannot be swayed to believe for a minute that Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre could have been wrong. Wow.
So it's put a lot of strain and heartache and sadness into our family. Since those of myself and some of my siblings have left the SSPX now. Mm-hmm. And so, that's one of those things that I kind of realized as it's happening, like as I'm leaving the SSPX, and they're kind of warning, like, oh no, like they really are scared for us, right? Like, oh, you got to be careful, And I'm sitting here, and there's just sort of a lack of understanding of, because people like to say that traditional Catholics are so well educated in the faith, and I beg to differ. I really do. Like perhaps they've memorized the Baltimore Catechism, or they know things like that, but they certainly don't know the history of the church, past or like 1960 or pre maybe 1950 or something. There's just, it's almost like they do think that this is an unprecedented time. This has never happened in the church. And it's interesting because one of the books that started to make me realize that was just nonsense was a book called Scandal of the Cross and Its Triumph. It was written by Bob and Penny Lord. And it literally just lists all of the heresies and schisms and errors throughout the history of the Catholic Church. And there's so many of them. And I'm sitting here going, yeah, this is not unprecedented at all. There's always been problems, that have arisen and that the church has had to deal with. And the answer has never been to leave the church.
Yeah.
So,
or that the whole church would be such a danger, it would infect you. So you have to remove yourself, but still say you're in the church. I mean, that's only heretics did things like that.
That's one of the main things that I just kept coming back to as I was coming out of the SSPX. And I want to go back and cover some more of those years because it's kind of important to me coming out of the SSPX. But one of the things that really stuck out to me as I'm leaving is the fact that, is the church indefectible or not? If the church is indefectible, then you can't say that it's a danger for us to go to the masses in the church, because it's a different liturgy than the TLM. And so you can't have it both ways, you know? And the other thing that I kept thinking, again, because I'm just a simple person, so I know it's in the Baltimore Catechism, the 4 marks of the church, this was a frustrating thing for me as a teen, because okay, 1, holy, Catholic, or universal, and apostolic, those are the 4 marks of the church. Well, 1, the SSPX and the church, we're not one, and holy, I mean, define holy. I mean, is it looking, is holy mean that you look holy? Or, or that there's holiness there, true holiness. And then universal, certainly the SSPX wasn't universal. Apostolic, yes. But as we know, they've, after leaving, they've
coached apostolic.
They may be valid, right? They're valid, but illicit, right? Because they have no mission and they have no jurisdiction. And so anyway, but that bothered me as a teen. I didn't have words for it, but when I really did believe in trying to convert people to the faith. And I know that a lot of SSPXers don't really bother about that too much. It's kind of like, you take care of yourself and your family, and, we have to get them to heaven. And there's not a whole lot of thought for people outside of the SSPX. And another problem that people ran into was that people weren't very welcoming. So we finally had a meeting at one of our parishes. Hang on just a minute.
Oh, you're good. Oh, she's got COVID. Put on your masks, everybody.
I don't know. I think it's dust. Hang on a minute. I'm going to get a drink of water real quick.
Oh, you're good. Can you still hear me, Anastasia? Oh, no, she left. Oh, man.
I'm still here, but
you're good. No, it's just interesting what you're saying. What you were saying earlier about the elitist attitude that was so common. It's like, well, we have the corner on the truth, and like all those poor other people, they're deceived. But it's not like then it doesn't follow through to any kind of outreach. It's like, I honestly can't think of one person I ever met in the Novus Ordo church, world that was like that. It's like everybody was, willing and like happy to share their faith, or they're like, it's just understood that we're supposed to be sharing and bringing people in and not keeping to ourselves what we have. Like, we have the best thing out there and we want other people to know about it. I mean, not everybody was as dedicated to, beating the bushes for non-Catholics, but it's like, oh boy, yeah. I mean, it's good to know that you're, you have the truth, but it's not like it was given to you to bury in the backyard, like the guy in the parable with the one talent, and he gets in trouble for doing that. It's like, oh yeah, scripture nails so much of this stuff, just like out of the gate,
Yeah. And in fact, I mean, we did learn that stuff. We would read from the My Catholic Faith, and it has all of that in there. And that's part of the reason too why I realize it's like we have to share the good news. That sounds so Novus Ordo. The good news of Christ, with our brethren, and bring them into the faith. Like that's our mission. Like we can't, how selfish of us to just keep it to ourselves and just be so intent on, well, I'm just worried about myself. I'm going to, yes, that is our vocation, to get ourselves to heaven.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, it's selfless and compassionate to think of our brethren and try to bring them into the church. Mm-hmm. And so that was really rough, because I'm sitting here going, okay, well, how do you explain to these people, like, well, yes, you should come into the church. And they're like, but like, you're saying you're traditional Catholic, but then what's, like, is there some other kind of Catholic?
Yeah, right.
And you're like, oh boy, well, we're better Catholics.
We're not deluded Catholics. If that helps.
It just didn't work, well, we actually have the truth. Like, they don't know what they're doing. They don't, they're not educated. They don't know that the TLM is the only liturgy that one can attend,
Yeah.
Now thinking back, it's just kind of embarrassing. But at the time it was a frustration, because it's like, well, how do I convert these people and tell them the differences? Well, that's the modernists. The modernists are running that over there.
Yeah.
So that part was rough as a young girl, teenager. Just, trying to do what the church teaches us to do. And there were different things like that came up in my life. I remember, talking to my friends or my cousins, and it was kind of like, okay, well, what makes us more correct than, like, say, these popes? Like how can we think that these popes are all wicked, and that they don't know anything, and that going to that liturgy, the new liturgy, is a danger to our faith? In fact, it was considered a mortal sin. They in the society, I don't know if they like to say this out loud, but they have a book called Christian Warfare, and in the examination of conscience, it was in there. It was like, have you attended a Novus Ordo Mass? And so we were taught to believe that it was a mortal sin to attend the new liturgy. And it's interesting because, a couple, I don't know, I was probably had already been married maybe 8 or 9 years at this point, and I was asked to play the organ for a wedding at a Novus Ordo Mass. And I knew the family, and so I said okay, but I was really like not it didn't sit well with me that I was going to go play in a Novus Ordo church. Yeah. And I mean, to the point that I actually asked an SSPX priest, like, can I do this? Now, like, oh my goodness, but at the time, that's how worried I was. And he did say, he's like, well, it's a job, right? Like, you're getting paid for it, so you just have to look at it like a job, and it's fine. And so I remember going, so
it's okay if money is involved.
Right. Yeah,
wow. Oh no. Oh my gosh. It's not a practice of sin anymore because it's just a job.
Well, whoa. I mean, he did say as long as you're not participating, it's fine. He did tell me that. So, but anyway, I went there the night of the rehearsal, and what was happening when I got to church was a priest was saying mass at the altar, and I was interested because I had never seen a Novus Ordo mass before, and so I went into the church because I wanted to see this go down, and catch him in all these, horrific abuses.
Yeah, with his smudge spots.
Right.
Liturgical dancers. Oh no. No, I mean that stuff really happened and it's terrible. I mean, it's like if you can't, laugh, you just cry about it, but Yeah.
Well, but I really did think that was commonplace. Yeah. And so I actually knelt in the back of church, like 3 pews up. It was a huge church. It was like the biggest parish in the town we lived in, so it was massive. And I sat just 3 pews up, and I was, all the people that were going to mass were kind of in the front there. It was just an evening mass, and I'm watching, and like the altar boy is doing very similar things to what I'm used to, and in fact he's even dressed in like altar boy clothes. And the priest has vestments on, and some of the things I didn't recognize, but certainly it wasn't irreverent. It wasn't, terrible. And so it was funny. It was kind of funny because this priest then, as he's giving the Eucharist to everybody, and actually I kind of remember that there were some that received on the tongue, and I was kind of surprised about that. And then there were some that received in the hand. Well, he happened to see me in the back, and I was the only one that hadn't come up for communion. And all of a sudden, he starts walking back with the Eucharist, and I'm freaking out in my mind. Okay, this is how like brainwashed I was, And I'm just going, what am I going to do? What am I going to tell this guy? Because I could have received the Eucharist. Like I wasn't in the state of sin, Yeah. But anyway, I'm like, why is he walking back here? What if I am in the state of, mortal sin?
Yeah, right.
So anyway, but he comes back all the way, and I knew he was coming back because there was nobody else around me. And I just put my 2 fingers on my mouth, and he saw that, but then he just blessed me with the Eucharist, which I don't know if he was planning on doing that anyway. I didn't know that they do that. That you can just come up and be blessed even if you can't receive. And so, like where I was raised, like, oh no, like if you sit on your soul, mortal sin on your soul, you don't go up. And so, and everybody's sitting there judging, like, why didn't you go to communion? I mean, I laugh about that, but actually that's not that uncommon. It's not, because there were a lot, like I've had conversations with people, and people who are like, yeah, and then I happened to eat, I ate, and then I realized that I couldn't go to communion because I, wasn't within the hour. And so I'm sitting here like, and everybody's going to think I have mortal sin on my soul, And so that's just really sad.
That's so sad. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not funny, but at the same time, I know that feeling, especially because when you're at a little mass like that, and everybody probably goes every day, and then they're like, woo, like not only are you new, but then it's like, what's she going to do? It's cute that the priest reached out to you, though.
Right.
Like, just to make sure you were included somehow.
Yeah.
Oh, he left the sanctuary.
It was just very kind. It was very kind.
Right
and yeah, that part didn't bother me that much. It was the fact that he was going to give me the Eucharist, which I wasn't sure if it was the Eucharist. Did he use the right words? Did he, all these things that we're taught are somehow our problem, right? Like this is why we're told, like, well, something that my mom always said, she still does. She goes, well, we were taught that if there's any doubt at all, you just don't go. And I'm like, but I don't know who she was taught by, maybe Archbishop Lefebvre, maybe she was referring to him, but it was kind of like, well, that's not our problem. It's not our problem. But I thought it was for a long time until I didn't. And I was just like, I'm going to leave that one up to God, I'll let him handle that. So,
yeah.
So
what an experience to just happen upon, and that you were willing to, sit through it, even though you thought it could be crazy, but it wasn't as bad as you thought it would be. Like that mass.
No, I mean, that mass wasn't the wedding mass. The wedding mass was different for me in that, so it was a full mass with lectors, and they had some of their family members go up there and be in the pulpit, and so that was odd to me. But I don't really remember what I felt about it, other than, okay, it's different, but it's certainly not a clown mass. And so that was kind of an experience that opened my eyes a little bit. And I don't know, I was probably late 20s by the time I saw that. It was the first mass, Novus Ordo mass I'd ever attended.
Wow.
And so there was that. And then, after, so what year was it that the Pope Benedict's motu proprio came out regarding the traditional Latin Mass, and allowing, saying that the Latin Mass was never abrogated, and essentially, telling the bishops that if your priest wants to say the Latin Mass, they can,
I think it was like 2007 or something like that. I think it was right around 2008, 2009.
Okay.
Around there, yeah.
Okay. That sounds about right. I know I'd been married a couple years at that point. And that's actually was sort of the start of me starting to see more things that I felt were problems in the society. And it was kind of because, so in our town then, after the motu proprio came out, we had some people in the local Novus Ordo parish must have asked for the Latin Mass or something. And so the priest started saying it. And he started saying it in the very town that our parish was in, the SSPX parish. And I was like, okay, and nothing was ever said about it. Nothing was ever said from the pulpit. And it's interesting because, see, in the society, we had prayed, I think, for like a year, at least a year. Bishop Belay told all of us that we needed to say 1,000,000 rosaries that the Pope would allow the traditional Latin Mass back. And there were like 3 different stipulations that what would be, was it the excommunication, that the excommunication would be lifted. And there was one other thing, I don't remember what it was. And so we prayed and prayed these 1,000,000 rosaries. We got over 1,000,000 throughout the whole society. And right after that, this motu proprio came out. And I'm sitting here going, well, this is an answer to our prayer, like now it's opened up other priests to say it, because at the time, obviously, my whole mentality was wrapped around the idea that our salvation is in the traditional Latin Mass. Like, we have to have the traditional Latin Mass back, no other liturgy will suffice.
Yeah.
And now I realize, how mistaken that mentality is, but that was the mentality. And but I also understood, like, okay, so now we have a local priest, diocesan priest saying the Latin Mass, and our priests don't want anything to do with this priest. They don't really, a couple times, like, the priest would come over for compliment even, and they didn't really welcome him. He wasn't super welcomed by all the priests. And then also, why weren't they saying, like, you're welcome to go to mass there. Like, this is a diocesan parish. They're saying the Latin mass. No, they wanted nothing to do with it. So still, even after all of these million rosaries, and after the Pope put out that motu proprio, there was nothing about, well, now we'll be converging with Rome, and we're all going to be one again. And that sort of thing. There was no talk about that. There was still like, oh no, the Pope isn't meeting this and this and this stipulation of the SSPX,
Yeah.
And I started to that started to bother me, because it's like, well, are we just going to hang out here forever? And at that point, I didn't realize sort of the undercurrent either of the political undercurrent and the moral current of the SSPX, which I was about to find out pretty soon after that.
Yeah.
Which is what really, really started making me question things. But it did bother me. I was like, we prayed for this. It's here, and now no mention of it. Wow. Nobody's talking about it.
Yeah.
And two, because I've always been interested in, and it's so easy to get information. I was kind of looking in other areas and asking other people, like, do you have a local Latin mass, diocesan Latin mass? And hearing about all these priests learning the Latin diocesan priests learning and incorporating it into parishes. And so, it was just weird to me. I'm like, I thought aren't we going to be friends now?
No. Yeah. We all want the same thing. Isn't that interesting though? I mean, I don't want to say this to sound like really negative, but it almost seems like a string along tactic. Like, you're always holding out this carrot of eventually we're going to have union and we're all going to be doing the same thing and believing the same thing, and it's going to be great, but really not, because it'll never really happen that everything will be done on the SSPX's terms, and they know that.
Yeah, for sure.
It's so weird.
Yeah. Well, and that is when I started to realize sort of the dishonesty too. It's like, I think we should be, I was thinking like, I think we should be supporting this local diocesan priest who is doing the right thing, right? In my mind. Okay. You have to understand, this was in my mind at the time. He's doing this good thing, and nobody's supporting him. Why aren't we supporting him? And so anyway, that was just always, so occasionally, so I would go there occasionally. Another friend and I would go there, and we were never told, like in the parish, like, you're not allowed to go, but it was just kind of a known, like, they wanted to dissuade people from going. Because see, we don't really know if their ordination is valid, if, we don't really know, like, some of these things, right? They would always like plant seeds of doubt, like, well, we don't, all of these things that don't matter to us, like, that are none of a layperson's like business. We have no business even questioning that sort of thing, because that's not for us to question. But it was all
church. It's so weird. It's like, wait, you're not supposed to question. You're just supposed to do what you're told, and not, if you have a question, you just suppress it. But it's like, since when does the church close doors on you when you want to know something? Like, since never that I've known. That's one of the greatest things about the church. It's like wide open. It's not supposed to be cultish where there's only certain people get to know certain things.
Right.
Weird.
Yeah. Well, and at the same time that was going on, there was a huge thing in our own parish. A man had been a pillar of the parish. In fact, like, this older man was looked upon like, he had money, he donated so much, he was so generous, and he was generous to all the parishioners. And so he was like a pillar of the parish. And come find out, he had been there was a really, really brave girl that came forward and said that he was abusing her. And then there was another girl, really, really brave girl, that came forward. And they were super brave, because what happened after that threw me for a loop. Like, I didn't even know how to handle the situation. But what ended up happening is, so this guy, who had donated a lot to the parish or whatever, is found out in the court of law to have abused these girls. There was evidence. He was convicted. He was sent to jail. But all through the process, like from the beginning, when the girls first came out, these young girls were attacked, like horrifically attacked by the parishioners in the parish.
Oh,
By most of them.
wow.
There was a handful that did not blame the girls and that were, horrified.
Yeah.
And my husband and I were like one of that handful.
Wow.
And we lost friends over it. And like it basically it really did like come and like sort of split the parish even at that time, because we're just sitting here going, wait a second, like how are all these, like, what, you're blaming these young girls who
Yeah,
had been abused
they
for
don't have
years?
anything to gain from this. Everybody hates them now. It's like,
Right.
okay.
Well, nothing to gain, but also they were young girls when it was happening. They come out and so what my husband and I did, the very first thing that we did when we found this out, right? Because everybody's first question, the first like sort of natural question, if you don't know anything about sexual abuse, is like, well, what the heck? Why didn't the girls come? Why didn't they tell their parents the first time that it happened? Why this? Why this? And it's always questioning the victim. It's never like, it's bizarre because it's like we're dealing with a 60-plus-year-old man here, and somehow it's these little girls' fault. I'll never understand that. But because that was the reaction, we started, my husband and I just started educating ourselves. We read book after book after book. We would search things on the internet, and and then that's when we found out, like, there's this thing called grooming, and these predators groom their victims sometimes years before they'll even ever physically touch them.
Wow.
And it's this whole like brainwash and mind control, and this, like, they're dealing with innocent children, and so the children like them, right? They trust them, and they're kind of like another parent to them, so of course they trust them.
Yeah.
And then they do this thing that doesn't, like, it makes the child feel uncertain, and it makes them feel gross and shameful.
Yeah.
But this is a person who love and they trust, and why would a person like that hurt them, And so it just started to make sense to us. But what we could not stand was the fact that all of these parishioners were just like destroying these girls. They were just awful. Like, there were letters that were written to the judge in the situation, defending the predator and saying these girls are a bunch of hussies, they blah blah, just accusing them of all kinds of atrocities. And the thing is like, some of these parishioners didn't know that those letters would be made public. It was kind of an accident that it was supposed to be red tape put on them by the predator's lawyer, and that didn't happen. And so then those became public, and so it was just this huge mess. Wow. And then in the meantime, the way that the SSPX was dealing with it, because this particular situation was happening on their property. These girls were being abused. They were being taken out of classes to meet this guy. They were being abused. And so the society's response to that was ridiculous. Like, it was just absolutely insane. And the priest at the time at first was like, well, no, we need to have the victim's parents and this guy come in so we can work this out. Let's try. Like, this was before like even the police were called, and it was like, let's try to work this out. And so finding out about that was like, what? What do you mean? Let's work this out,
It's kind of late for that.
Yeah. And I was like, how often is this happening in the society? Like, and so then my husband and I, so then there were like letters sent to Bishop Fillet about it at the time. And his answer was less than, desirable. And we weren't getting answers. Like the behavior of the SSPX in regard to this, the behavior of the parishioners, and the parishioners were not being told to, like, how, well, I shouldn't say that. One sermon, I do remember the priest saying, you can't blame the girls, but it didn't really stop. It didn't really stop them.
Gosh.
And so anyway, so he went to jail. Okay, so that was a huge fiasco. We, like I said, lost friends over it, because there were people that were like in our face, like, how dare you? We were one of the only ones that sat in on the the court hearing and supported those girls, and they just attacked us. So after they found out that we were supporting the girls, then they attacked us, and it was like, this is just weird, this is just strange.
Yeah. Like, why even get involved? I mean, isn't that something you kind of want to stay away from? And even just to preserve your parish unity, like, let's just keep our heads above water. And
well, it was interesting because that's what they were telling us. They were saying it was none of our business and we shouldn't be involved. And it was like our involvement literally was, we support the girls. How dare you people support this predator?
yeah.
And so
we're taking sides, and then they were just acting like you were the only one doing it. Very interesting.
Right. Well, and at the time too, it was interesting because, I want to say, yeah, it may have even been after. I want to say it was after he was exposed, and our eldest son had just died. He died at 8 months old. And there was a cemetery just being built on this church property.
Mm-hmm.
And this couple, this with money, the predator and his wife, offered to pay for a huge statue of an angel to put in the cemetery for him. And I just thought, yeah, you're not going to buy us. You're not going to buy us. I mean, maybe you bought the people in this parish, but that's not. So that was really weird.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that was kind of the beginning, really, of the end to our goodbye to the SSPX, because we were totally scandalized. We were horrified at the behavior, scandalized at the reaction, and like, this isn't Catholic. This is not how people should behave in these situations. And so, I mean, fast forward, because then he spent a couple, I don't know, not long enough in jail. He should still be in jail. Because there were also some of his victims, the statute of limitation, they did come forward, but the statute of limitations was up. And so they were not considered when in that case. So he abused a lot more girls than he was able to be convicted for at that time.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, fast forward, I don't know, probably 10 years, really, almost 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And, we had, there was a new priest at the time. And as soon as he came in, like, we knew at that time, me having worked in their schools, like, there's no communication between these people. And we were going to make sure that our new parish priest knew this story, knew the situation, and would deal with it properly, because we knew he was getting out of jail. And we also heard that the family kept saying, well, we're coming back. They were so mad that any of us would dare to be like, you're not welcome here. And, it's like one thing. Yeah, please do. Please go back to the church, go to confession, receive the Eucharist. But there better be stipulations on this guy. And you don't get to come back to this parish, because this is where your victims' families and your victims still go to church. You don't get to come. You don't get the privilege of coming back. So anyway, so I don't know. Tell me if I'm going down a rabbit hole. I don't want to give too much like detail on a situation you don't want to hear about. But anyway, so that was just kind of what really started opening our eyes, I guess.
Right. Well, because when he got out of jail, he did come back, right? And they welcomed him
exactly.
back.
So what happened was, for a couple years he didn't. And then we kept hearing like these rumblings, like, oh, he's going to come back, and we're like, no. The parish priest, like, he knows the whole story. Matt had very thoroughly spent hours talking to him about all the details of what went down and what happened. Mm-hmm. And our parish priest had promised, he's like, well, that he's not coming back under my watch, essentially was what he said. Okay. And so one day, we go walking into church, and he's sitting there, and he's surrounded by families, by little girls sitting all around him, no restrictions, because also I actually started looking into what like the diocesan churches, like what their restrictions were for convicted pedophiles, essentially, and they were very strict. Like, they had to have a chaperone with them at all times on the property if they were going to be going to a certain parish. Everybody had to be warned. All the families were warned that he was a predator. There was this whole list of what, the diocesan parish required.
Yeah.
And none of that was done, Laura. Literally, he was just there. And nobody was warned. And by that time, 10 years later, like, there were new families, a lot of new families that didn't know anything about this story. And
Wow.
so we just couldn't believe it. We were just floored. And so my husband ended up reaching out to the pastor at the time and said, what the heck is going on? This is totally unacceptable. And basically the priest said, it's none of your business. Like, I'm under holy obedience to my superiors, and my superior, who was Father Wegner at the time, was the district superior, has told me that this is what's happening, right? Well, and at first, before he even said that he was under holy obedience to his superior, he actually said, it's none of your business. Whatever I decide is what you're going to follow, essentially. And in a couple of years, they had been having these like more and more frequent sermons on like obedience to them. They are our authority, and we are to obey them. And we would kind of like be like, why are they hitting on this so hard? Like, what is what is the deal here?
Right.
And it just seemed to be happening more and more frequently. And a couple of years later, I just thought about the irony that, these guys demand absolute obedience. These guys from this group who were founded on disobedience,
Oh, yeah, right. Someone just said in the chat, how ironic.
Yeah, truly.
Yeah.
And so exactly. And so what ended up happening then was, when that didn't work with us, because my husband and I, we just riled up the whole parish. Like, at that point, there were quite a few people who felt guilty for doing what they had done. And they kind of, had a change of heart or whatever. And I just got on the phone and I was just saying, are you okay with this? Are you okay with this? This is not okay. And we rounded up like 60 people that we were going to have a meeting with, and we're going to be like, this is unacceptable, And so what ended up happening, the pastor found out that we were having this meeting. So then it changed. It was like, no, I'm under holy obedience. I'm listening to my superior. And so back off, this is none of your business. And so then he found out that we were going to have a meeting, because we were going to have a meeting with him. He had agreed to a meeting. And so then he found out that we were having a meeting with 60 parishioners. And he told us, he texted Matt, and he's like, Am I understanding correctly that you're having a meeting at your house tonight with parishioners? And and he goes, and if you are, our meeting is off. And so that's fine. I don't need a meeting with you then. Goodbye, And so we did end up having a meeting. So we basically raised enough hell to have the district superior come out 2 weeks later, but it was 2 weeks later, so it was still kind of like, they were like, oh, we don't need to listen to you peons, you're just a bunch of lowly parishioners. And so he ended up coming out, and the whole thing, it was like we were living in the Twilight Zone. He had like set up tables in this like circular thing, and he stood in the middle, and he was telling us how, he was just totally gaslighting us the entire time. And he was saying, at first it was like, we need to forgive, like you are not charitable at all. And also he was upset because several of us had sent letters to Bishop Fillet, and we were like, we demand an answer, essentially.
Yeah.
And so the first thing he said is, he goes, how dare you? He was a German priest. How dare you contact Menzingen? And we're just like, you don't scare us.
No.
And so anyway, then he was gaslighting us the entire time. And I just see like the parishioners going, like, starting to feel guilty, because he's like, and if anybody is to blame, it is you for not seeing that this man was abusing people. Okay, so he's saying this.
What?
He's trying to get us to be okay with him coming back. And the whole thing was just ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I'm looking around at my fellow parishioners, and some of them are hanging their heads like in shame, like, oh yeah, I mean, I did see some things, and they were even admitting that to him, like there were some red flags, but I mean, I didn't know that's why, and I was trying to give him the benefit of charity, and you're just sitting here going, what are you doing? And I come out of that meeting and I'm like, that entire thing was a fiasco. So he ended up telling us, he goes, well, you know, because you guys have thrown a childish fit, you know, he won't be coming back for now, but there is no promise that he will not come back. And so anyway, that was not an okay answer for my husband and I.
No.
And so we decided that we were done with it. Like at that time, we were so upset and we were so scandalized at the behavior of the SSPX and the fact that there was just no sympathy for the victims, just none. No compassion, no empathy, no care for their souls, no care for their families.
Yeah.
And I was just like, this isn't okay. And so we ended up started going to the diocesan parish there at the time. But we still weren't totally convinced. Well, I think I was more convinced than my husband. It still kind of worried my husband a little bit because of the same reasons that we're talking about, all of these things that we're brainwashed to believe, all the talking points of the SSPX, you know, it's a danger to your soul. You know, how are your children going to keep the faith if, you know, what if they decide to take the TLM away, all of this stuff, right? All of these things that I've to realize are just nonsense. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I love the 1962 liturgy. I love the traditional Latin Mass, but I've just come to understand that my salvation is not in the TLM. It's not in a specific liturgy. And the other thing,
what about the other rites of the church? Like you said to me another time, like there's 23 other rites in the church, and we talk about the old form of the Roman rite, like it's all there is to talk about. It's like, okay.
Well, exactly. And in fact, I really wanted to talk about that because I think one of the big things that was so convincing to me was the realization, because I didn't really know about the other 23 rites under the Catholic Church, you know. A Roman rite was just one of those rites. And when I found out about it, it was just like this, it was like this aha moment, like, whoa, you know, because every one of their liturgies is different, right? It's not the traditional Latin Mass. And I also, so that it actually really bothers me now when I hear there's so much talk of like the Mass of the Ages, this phrase. I'm like, it's just like another traditionalist phrase. It's like means nothing really, unless you're talking about the Eucharist, because the Mass of the Ages. So are you saying then that the 1962 liturgy is the Mass of the Ages, you know?
I mean, that's not all time. Oh, that one takes the cake. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So basically, like, that's so arrogant, you know, and self-righteous to say such a thing, because it's like, well, what about the 23 other rites? Every one of their liturgies is different.
Yeah.
Are you saying that isn't the Mass of the Ages?
Yeah. Right.
So, and so it's really just kind of an ignorant statement, and I don't like it.
No, well, what you were saying earlier about traditionalists, you know, they memorize different tenets of the faith, and they can, you know, often supply that readily enough, but it's like they only know enough history to be able to sort of like make reference to the Council of Trent or St. Pius X and Quo Primum or whatever. It's like, okay, like they throw it out, but the more you dig, the more it's like, well, I didn't know about that. Well, I mean, I'm just assuming. It's like there's all these big holes, and they don't look at it in this continuity thing. It's like, how much did you study? Like the Council of Trent wasn't just this golden thing that went perfectly. I mean, the church kind of resisted it for at least 50 years after, and it was pretty much ignored and its implementation delayed. So it's like, gee, that kind of sounds familiar. Like, what was that like to live through, you know? And people were throwing back their heads and howling then, and it was not easy.
Well, for sure. And going back to, you know, the Quo Primum, like that one just makes me laugh, because the trads, they just scream Quo Primum. And yet the very Pope that, you know, put out Quo Primum was the Pope that abrogated whole rites in the Catholic Church, you know?
Right.
And they act like, oh no, the Pope doesn't have the authority to do that. What are you talking about? That very Pope that put that out, like, has no authority over future popes, but he's the one that abrogated some of these rites. There was nothing wrong with them, you know? What was it? I believe I was listening to Andrew Bartel talk about, was it called the Galatan Rite? Where and it went all the way back to Saint Polycarp, who is a disciple of Saint John. I think that's the correct story. And basically he completely abrogated this rite. And so not only like the people, you know, the faithful who went to this rite, like, I'm sure that they were howling too, but they were told, like, you're going to have to incorporate into a totally different rite, not even a different liturgy.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, no, that had to be rough. I mean, yeah, like maybe all the generations of your, you know, entire family line that you knew of had known nothing but that same rite, or even, you know, in Quo Primum, when he abrogates any rite that's younger than 200 years old, it's like, that's still like 4 generations of people that would have been like, are you kidding? Like, this is our heritage. How can you do this? Like, that hurt people. But
the society is 50 years.
You got to trust your father. Like, he had a reason for it. It's like, you can't just let it splinter endlessly. I mean, traditions are great. Liturgies are great. Like you said, it wasn't because there was something wrong with them. It wasn't for stamping out abuse. But at the same time, it's like legislation. If we're not willing to concede the right of legislating governance of the church to the Pope, then what are we doing talking about being Catholic?
Sure. Well, and that was another thing that started to just stick out to me. It's like, oh yes, no, we believe the Pope is the Pope, but we're not going to obey a thing he says.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that work? And how to, you know, again, in coming, so papal primacy, you know, so it's like, so you don't believe in that. And you believe, and again, so I'm going to come back to the fact that I'm just a simple person. And it's like, you know, our Lord promised us, like, he promised that he would not leave his church. And his faithful, and he gave the keys to St. Peter. So if for you to think that you're going to save the church by leaving the church, it's just absolutely silly. It's insane. And so I those are the things that I've come to realize, like, I don't have to worry about. It's actually it's simpler. Life is simpler. I don't have to worry about whether the priest is saying the right words, you know, whether he's facing the people, whether all of this stuff, it's not relevant to my salvation.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And it's so freeing to realize, like, it's so wonderful. We're under this umbrella, like the Catholic Church, and we're safe here. And yeah, you know, there's corrupt priests in the church, for sure. Corrupt clerics. But if they don't tell us, you know, if they don't demand that we need to do something sinful, like, what is your excuse? Because we're supposed to obey in all that is not sinful.
Right. Yeah.
And how is the Pope and the church coming up with a different liturgy? How is that sinful?
Yeah.
Right. What is sinful about it? But what I have found is that when part of the journey coming back over was I wanted to know what was in the Vatican II documents, because my parents never read them. Nobody I knew had actually read the documents. You know, it was just like, oh, well, you know, they just read Michael Davies' book, and they read, you know, all of these articles from, you know, Catholic Family News and the Remnant. And okay, but like, what do the actual documents say? Because there's a lot of like accusations here, but nothing to back it up. And so then I started. I just went to YouTube and I started. There, you know, were a couple people that were talking about the documents, and I just learned a lot from them. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. Okay, so there aren't any errors in Vatican II documents, as I was told my entire life, you know, that it was heretical. There were heretical documents. And so that was another sort of eye-opener that I just was like, well, that's interesting. You know. So like, how many more lies was I told? let's just keep digging, right? Let's just keep like peeling the onion, because that's how I really do use that analogy, because that's how it feels. It was like, once I was like totally scandalized by the behavior in the SSPX, to the point, and I literally just touch on that because there's a whole lot more that I know. But
Yeah.
once that happened, it was like I was able to like sort of peek above that cult cloud, you know, and I was like, and then you start like learning something else, and you just keep having these, oh, interesting aha moments, you know, and then it doesn't stop. And it was interesting because once then I came, you know, we just totally we came to a point where we just embraced it. We're like, we are Catholic in the Catholic Church. And the other sort of big betrayal and the last straw for us to accept everything was the realization that supplied jurisdiction that they claim is nonsense. It just absolutely, they do not qualify for supplied jurisdiction. John Salza helped, you know, us realize that. His website's amazing for anybody who is wanting to educate themselves regarding the SSPX. It's I think his website is trueorfalsepope.com, I think.
Oh yeah.
Or just look up John Salza. And just realizing that, so they had no jurisdiction. All of these sacraments that we've received, that our children have received, you know, from these valid priests, but like illicit, they have no mission, they have no jurisdiction,
Right.
are invalid. And finding out that my marriage of 16 years is invalid,
Wow.
it was just unbelievable. There was, in the beginning, there was just so much anger, like, how dare you do this to us?
Gosh.
Do this, and not just us, thousands upon thousands of couples are invalidly married.
Yeah.
No wonder all these marriages fall apart, and there's so much abuse in these families in the SSPX, and there's just chaos, just absolute. We're not even gaining graces from the church.
Yeah.
How
Right.
horrific. That was like, that betrayal was just beyond it. It just like my just anger from that. And so, and it was interesting because once we realized that, like, we started realizing things faster and faster. Like I would be like, you know, read this or listen to this, honey. You know, I was talking to my husband, or I would read him something, and we're just shaking our heads, you know, and it just became really clear to us. And then as soon as we got our marriage convalidated, that was just a whole other level of finally like having the grace on our marriage and in our family from the church. I realized that it's not, you know, cool to say, and I, you know, the feelings that I had or whatever, but truly I could feel the graces coming into our marriage and coming into our family. But in the meantime, while that's happening, there's still all of this chaos sort of in my personal family, you know, between my parents and my siblings. And we're sort of at all different levels in coming into the church or realizing certain things. And some of them are not there at all. I mean, some still believe that, you know, the SSPX is right. But it was just interesting that I was still at peace, even though there was all of this. It still is, you know, chaos in our family, and angst and upset, and you know, maybe some people feel shame, guilt, or whatever, and others just feel angry that we would betray them, because, you know, that's the other thing in the SSPX is very interesting, is that when you belong, well, you're not a member of the SSPX, you know, they make that distinction very often. You are an adherent to, or a follower, or just a faithful, you know, one of the faithful that goes to an SSPX mass. But you know, as they, hang on, just sorry.
Oh, you're good.
So no, after realizing that, you know, coming back into the church, I think that our Lord was kind of infusing us with this knowledge that we had not even been allowed to, or we didn't have access to at the time that we were, because the society is very, that's what I was saying. The society is very cultish in the sense that they're almost like, it's like the Amish. If the minute that you are kind of questioning them, in disagreement with them, with your family as well, the minute you start questioning or you leave the SSPX, it's like they feel that their job then is to shun you.
Wow.
Like you can't, you're so wrong. You've become a modernist. You've bought into this. And generally it's like accusations of, well, you just want an easier life as a Catholic, you just don't want to do hard things, which is such a cop-out, and it's just so untrue,
Like you can't be a hardcore Catholic in the Novus Ordo.
No, absolutely. And so what ends up happening then is, you're talking to your family and you're like, but look at this, like, and you'll try to show them something and it's like, no. And so I've had tons of family members who just won't talk to me anymore. Or they've told me, they've said, I still would like to be your friend. I would still like to get together with you, but these are the things you're not allowed to talk about. You're not allowed to talk about this. And so, and with those people, I have had to cut them off because, well, for my sanity, for my peace, because it was sort of this thing for the first couple of years where I was just mad. It was like, I'm trying to show you like where they're wrong, and bring them out of the cult, essentially bring them back into the church, like, I care about your soul and I want you to see what we're seeing. And the fact that they refuse to even look at any of it is just really telling of the mind control that the SSPX has over their followers.
Gosh. It's so weird that they can tell them, like, don't even look into this. Don't talk about it. Don't think about it. And it's like, and everybody just goes, oh, okay. It's like, yeah, that is really weird to me. I mean, is that something though that your parents kind of instilled in you, like that curiosity, or like, I want to know why I'm doing what I'm doing. If something doesn't sit right, I'm going to get to the bottom of it. Like, cause that is something I pick up from you that I don't get from a lot of people in traditionalism.
Well, yeah, interestingly enough, I do feel like that came from my dad, because our entire life, whether in the SSPV or SSPX, like, if something was off in the sermon, if something wasn't right, like, he had no problem coming home. He wasn't one of the trads. I've seen a lot of them where they just like worship the ground these priests walk on. He would just be like, he's totally wrong here. That's not right. That's nonsense what he said today. Why don't we stick to scripture and what Christ taught and not your personal opinions? All of that. And so he did allow us to question that stuff. And at the same time, what I've realized with my dad is that it's hugely emotional for him. And I know I don't mean that as an insult. My dad went to Catholic school growing up, and it was right during the 60s and 70s, kind of the prime time when all of these abuses started coming into the parishes. And so he kind of got the brunt of that, I think. And he saw these abuses, and it happened after Vatican II, right? And so there wasn't a distinction for him. There was not a distinction between Vatican II and the abuses. He just, well, what they call them, the changes. Okay. They don't really decipher either between the changes or the abuses. There's the changes in the liturgy, yes, which they accuse the church of having the Protestants, right? And then there's the abuses and the novelties, and there's never any distinction between that. It's all the same.
Right. Well, I don't remember the name of that Latin saying. If someone knows that, they can put it in the chat. But it's like, basically if something happens and then something follows, you, because they're proximate, you blame the first thing as causing the second thing, even if they're completely unrelated. I mean,
Sure.
but I mean, you can understand why people do that if they're not really educated, but then it's like, educate yourself. Like, you went and read the documents and stuff. What is Vatican II? Like, what did it really say? Not just somebody's interpretation of it.
Right. Well, and also there's so much, yeah, when you're emotionally involved in that, or have had this emotional thing, the other thing that happened was, his sister went to a convent. She basically went to a girls' school when she was 14. She never came home because she went to the girls' school and then she became a nun. And in that convent, and she was there quite a few years, something, along the lines of 7 years about. But there were so many abuses happening in that particular convent, and they were changing their dress from like these beautiful habits to like practically mini dresses, and completely removing the veil eventually. Like, it was little by little. But it was like she and they would be having almost like brainwashing sessions were going on with the liberals, right? They came in and they were trying, I don't know, like, I don't really know what was happening, but we heard these stories. And they were coming in and, there were things that happened. Like, my mom in grade school, the nun took the statue off of the pedestal of Our Lady, a statue of Our Lady off of the pedestal, put her on the ground, said, "There, now she is at our level where she belongs." And then there was another experience that my mom had when she was just a little girl, just second or third grade, where they took all of those children into another room and forced them to receive the Eucharist in the hand. And so these are horrible things in my parents' memories, and my grandparents were dealing with different, horrible priests at the time. And so when they saw the SSPX, it was like the lifeboat, right? Like, okay, this is where we can go and like protect our children. And so instead of staying in the church and demanding, like, that these abuses be removed, and doing what they can, like staying and just, praying, because that's the other thing my mom says is she goes, well, if we would have raised you in the Novus Ordo, none of you would have the faith. Which, again, it's an emotional argument, because it's like, well, how do you know? It's like, that's not really a good argument, for leaving the church. But see, they also don't see it as leaving the church. Okay, that's the other thing I need to point out. They see it as they are the church. The society is the church.
Right.
But it's so
Bill even said in his writings, he believed that the 4 marks of the church transferred to the SSPX when the conciliar church defected from the true faith. So he outright said that. So
right. So what do you do with that? It's like I'm praying for them, because I understand that it's so much harder for them, because when I do have a conversation with my parents, it ends up in this all, knock down, drag out fight, because they're so upset. They're like, you weren't there. You didn't see what we saw. You didn't, and it's like, I have to be like, right, I wasn't.
Yeah.
But I still have to say that we can't leave the church.
Yeah.
And really, what good has it done anybody? Like, if you're an honest person in the SSPX and you've been there from the time you were young, you see the absolute wicked fruit from them. I mean, it's something that throughout my entire life, I would just kind of like, no, okay, well, maybe they meant this by that, and maybe. And so you're always trying to make excuses for it, because your salvation is in the SSPX. Okay. Yeah. So these people really do think that. And the thing is, it's interesting, because so I have been involved in basically supporting the victims of the SSPX sex abuse cases, which are many. People don't like to talk about it, and they don't want to hear about it. But it's a serial problem in the SSPX. And one of the things that a French investigator, actually, we've been involved talking to people in other countries. He said that he has never seen a more sophisticated mind controlling organization in his life. When he was dealing with, because he was dealing with a specific case, and he just said the mind control and brainwash is unbelievable, and gaslighting.
Wow.
So they're good at it. They're good at what they do. I'm not sure if they, every priest meeting is like another session in teaching their guys how to mind control and manipulate and brainwash, but
yeah,
perhaps.
Right.
So,
well, a friend of mine who grew up in a kind of a rural chapel, his whole growing up was only the only thing he ever heard about the Novus Ordo and the Conciliar Church. It was just like you said, all abuses and all this stuff, like to the point where he didn't, he understood from that there was no way that liturgy could ever be reverent or anything. And it wasn't until he was an adult and researching like colleges, and he looked at Christendom College online. He's like, well, it says it's Catholic, let's find out about it. And they had like their introductory video showed pictures and parts from a mass that was celebrated on campus, and it was like beautiful and reverent. And he was just like, wait, what? Like, this isn't a traditional Catholic college. Like, what is this? And he looked into it and he's like, it just like struck him like everything I've ever been exposed to is propaganda. And I just didn't even allow that anything else could have been true. Like, until he ran into that, it's like, wait, like I was told this wasn't even possible. So what does this mean? And that's kind of what got him out with his journey out. And I mean, he still is very attached to the Latin Mass. I mean, he entered an FSSP, order. So he's like, I mean, obviously he believes in that, but it's like he acknowledges that there are other legitimate options, and you can't just standardize it like that and lie to people.
Right. Well, lie to people for for devious purposes. I mean, it's not for their salvation that they're being lied to. I mean, you're not allowed to lie to people, but also that wouldn't make any sense either, right? Like, we're going to lie to you to save your soul. But it's like, what I've come to realize is they like their money. They're worth a lot of money. They do like power. They do. Their priests are really, my friend and I used to always comment when we were still in the society, it's like, they don't live in reality. I think it's because so many people just absolutely idolize these priests and give them kudos, and they don't live in the real world where they're criticized and this sort of thing. They don't really feel any of that. They're in a bubble, a very protected bubble. And so they don't live in reality in the fact that it's like, what I say goes, and if you don't listen to me, there's the door, whatever. It's like there's no humility, none. Just like that priest that my husband was like, we were reaching out to, we were struggling. We were like, wait a second, like, this isn't okay. And he was just like, back off and shut your mouth, and it's like, and so you are just expected to listen to them. And if you don't, then there's the door, and they don't want you there anyway, because they don't want to have to deal with somebody who's given them problems.
Yeah. Right. Wow. Yeah. Not helping you to understand, not really being fatherly. It's like, as soon as there's like, again, this sounds like what I've heard from Mormon converts who talk about, as soon as they start asking questions and like, they know that that's not going to really be received, but when they just can't take it anymore and they go to their superiors, the superiors are just like, oh, how could you? And they just totally slam the door on them. And it's like they don't have compassion to offer. They're not trying to help. Like, you have questions, we have answers. We're going to help you. Like, we don't want you to be in doubt and anxiety. It's like, oh no. And I guess maybe because when you dig deep enough, they don't have answers. I mean, and the SSPX is like, or the answers you would find would lead you out, like you guys found. I mean, what initially got you to start asking more questions was like the moral scandal and everything you uncovered about that as you did more and more research and found more and more people. But then it's like, that is obviously kind of how the foot got in the door, it's like, that's what you were receptive to. And then you could understand and take in all that, like the doctrinal reasons, like the things that should have tipped you off before that you maybe had questionings about, but now you're like, that's why.
Right. Well, it did. It forced it. Like we had to find answers because we were so scandalized and horrified because what we had been taught our entire life is like, this is a superior group, right? They're like on this pedestal to us. Like this is the church. This, they have the answers to everything. And they, in fact, the SSPX would even say that in one of their, articles. It was actually put out by Wegener. It was after the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out. And this was actually before the scandals. It may have been in 2016 or 17. And he put out this letter. It was so unbelievable. Now that I look at it. But basically he said, this is just terrible that this is happening in the church. And the reason it's happening is because it's run by modernists, because of Vatican II. And this is why we don't have this problem in the SSPX. And that particular priest knows of hundreds. He's admitted, Father Jürgen Wegener has admitted to knowing about hundreds. We have it on a phone call. Hundreds of cases of sex abuse in the SSPX, and he had the nerve to put out this propaganda piece about the reason that they're pristine and above board as far as the sex abuse because Vatican II, right? So they blame everything on Vatican II. Yeah. And so it's just more gaslighting, more manipulation.
Yeah.
And they never have to answer for it, It's like that was brought up. We bring up that and we expose that online. Never. Just silence. Just silence. Yeah. So you're right. Like they're not fatherly when it comes down to it. They're a very wealthy organization and they have a great facade.
Oh yeah, it looks so good. It's like it looks like everything is in order. I mean, the externals, it's over and over. It's just like isn't that why people go over? Because it's like, you guys look like you got your ducks in a row. We're a mess over here. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's like this one priest I know says, jump on in. The water's terrible. I mean, it's never, necessarily, it's always a great time to be a Catholic, but it's always a bad time to be a Catholic because there's always crisis in the church. It's just a mess. Like, how could it not be? It's full of sinners.
Right. Well, I love Andrew Bartel's analogy. I'm sure he didn't come up with it himself, but about the ark and the fact that the church is the ark, and sometimes the waters are choppy, and that's just how it is, and it's been that way from the beginning of the church, and so you can't jump the ship and go think that, go out and go find this little life raft or something in these choppy waters and think that's going to save you.
Yeah. Right.
But again, I mean, it's just, it's also interesting because as you do learn about, okay, so there's the moral issues on the one side. And then as I went to, I was just reading more and I was researching, and John Salza kept coming up and I was reading his stuff. And it was just incredible because they're morally corrupt, but also like theologically, doctrinally, like totally corrupt in that area as well. And so for somebody, and so like the logical conclusion to me is like, okay, I can't judge Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre's soul. I'm not going to say, he's in hell. I can't say that. I can't judge his internals. But certainly what he did was a very bad thing, and you can say that and judge that based on, what you see. Again, I'm not a canon lawyer. I'm not a theologian, but it's even reading John Salza, he makes it pretty simple and pretty clear what has gone on and what has been said, what was said by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. So many people now who just jump into the SSPX because of their fake facade. It's like, oh, that looks great. Another thing that they always say, these people that join this, like, oh, well, they were the only ones that kept their churches open during COVID, which it's just absolute nonsense. Like, I feel like every time I hear one of these guys say that, I just want to scream, because at the time, still going to a chapel, and they closed the chapel there. They closed the big chapel over in Idaho. They closed in fact, one of their priests was saying mass out in a parking lot, and Wegner even closed that one down. So all over the country, they were closed down. Maybe not everywhere. I don't think in Texas, but like Texas didn't close down their other churches either. Like their Protestant churches stayed open. So it was more to do with the government of that state, or whatever, the governing of the state. But anyway, they just lie through their teeth, because they dang well know that churches closed. But see, they just repeat this lie, and they keep repeating it, and then enough people believe it, like, oh yeah, they're the only ones that kept their church open. No, they didn't. We didn't have church for months. So
it's like, these historical parallels that they put out too in favor of their position, and they give you just enough information, you feel like, oh wow, yeah, like I'm really being informed. But if you do more like scholarly digging, you find out that they totally took those saints or those stories out of context, or they took them from false accounts of history and like represented them to you as true. And you're like, oh wow, well, this apologist, this major apologist for the SSPX did it, and this one, and this one, and this one. You're like, and nobody got the slam down. It's like, so now everything I read from them is suspect. I mean, I have been this past year doing a lot of digging, because I had friends who went into the SSPX from Protestantism, and I was like trying to have these discussions with them, and I'm like, well, I better do my research, because if they're right, I better do what they did. But it's like, I couldn't dream of making that move now. The more I find out, the more incriminating it is. It's just like, oh wow, like, yeah, it's not fun to talk about that stuff. You don't want it to be true, but it's like, man, I want to live in the truth, because otherwise I'm sunk. And like you talk about the inner, like the piece of soul that you have, you never knew in your life before you came into the church. I mean, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that, and just your experience on the other side. Like, you've had pain and struggle, misunderstanding in your family, and these things are ongoing struggles. So there is desolation, but it's like, for other people looking at making a move, and they're just maybe paralyzed by the difficulties they may face, and they're wondering if it's worth it. Like, what do you have to say to them?
Yeah, it's totally worth it. Yeah, the peace of soul, the peace of mind, and then just learning how beautiful our faith is. My sister and I talk sometimes. Well, yes, she came over. They basically came over with us kind of when we joined the diocese. And so I've always had her as a sounding board, and it's like, we both talk about how we've really had to like throw everything out the door. Everything that we were told, we were taught. It's like, at first it was this thing where it was just like, my goodness, it was like overwhelming. It's like, what do I believe and what not to believe? Because as you start realizing their lies upon lies, and like just this total corrupt organization, and 50 years worth of lies, and then when you realize like your parents like fell into it hook, line, and sinker, and all of the literature that they've ever read has just been an echo chamber, right? It's like Michael Davies and all of the people that support the SSPX, and that's all they read. And it's like, okay, and then in Michael Davies stuff, I've been realizing that there's lies. And so my sister put it well. Like, she's 13 years younger, but she's a very smart girl, and she's like, Stage, I just had to throw it out. I just throw it out, and I'm going to learn my faith from the ground up again, and I'm going to learn what the church actually teaches about this.
Yeah,
And so my recommendation for people is just like truly seek out the truth, like regardless of the consequences, because there will be consequences. If you are an adherent in the SSPX, unless you have no other family that's in the SSPX, but many of us who are third, fourth generation SSPXers, most of our family is in the SSPX, and so you will be most likely, unless they'll talk to you about it and they're open to talking to you about it, you're probably going to lose family over it. And but like I said, it didn't matter to me. Once I came into the church and I felt that peace, and even I go to the 6970 liturgy, and I've just learned to love it. It's absolutely beautiful.
Right.
I don't really understand the problem with it. I'm like, why do they have a problem with this? Like, I get that there's a problem with the abuses, but being involved in the music and everything, we're singing Gregorian chant every Sunday. Like it's just, and there's so much more scripture. It's so rich in scripture. And so I just, all of the fear that these people have in the SSPX is just, it's kind of unfounded, really, because for them to say that, well, you can't save your child's soul if you go to a Novus Ordo mass. It's like, have you ever been to one? Have you been to a Novus Ordo mass?
Yeah.
And yeah, some people have, but then they've experienced the abuses. Okay, well then bring that up with your bishop.
Yeah.
Like, come back into the church and let's fight the abuses in the church, because you do no good standing outside of the church. Nobody takes you seriously. Nobody's going to listen to you, and ultimately you're not gaining any graces.
Yeah.
So you have to be open to the truth, and you have to be okay with sad things happening in your life.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're still in the midst of chaos, and in our family, and I pray for them, and they probably pray for me. They probably pray that we come back to the church, right?
Yeah. Prayers not wasted. It's just sometimes it surprises us how our prayers are answered.
Right. And so, but no, you're not going to go wrong in making that decision to come over, even if it's hard. And even if you do have, you suffer a little bit when you first come in, because when you come from the TLM and being told your entire life, like, your salvation is in this liturgy, and so if you go to this liturgy, this is a danger to your faith, then it's kind of, it's shocking a little bit, like, oh, is this okay? Is it okay that I'm here? And but in the meantime that you're doing that, you still have to continue to educate yourself, because as long as you're reading and I highly recommend, so many books have been they've been both Andrew and Dom from the Logos Project, they've recommended so many amazing books. And I'm in the process of reading 3 right now, which is The Catholic Controversy is excellent. And then Scott Hahn, all of his books are amazing. The way that he explains the Eucharist, the beauty of the Mass. And he's interesting because, did you ever hear him on one of his interviews, or somebody was interviewing him? It may have been Pints with Aquinas. And he was asked, so do you like the traditional Latin Mass? Do you like that liturgy? And he goes, oh, yes. It's beautiful. He goes, I actually prefer the new liturgy, the Novus Ordo, because that's what I converted into.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought that was interesting because, a lot of people, they see the TLM, they're like, oh, this is so beautiful. I don't know, maybe they were going to a less than desirable Novus Ordo liturgy, and they just love the beauty. But there is so much beauty in these masses, in the new liturgy. And I think that what we need to do as faithful, and I was actually told this when we first left originally the SSPX, and we went and talked to some of these Novus Ordo priests who are amazing. They said, we need you, we need you in the church. They were so welcoming. And that was when my husband and I still we were still oh, is this okay that we're doing this? And they're like, we need you. God has blessed you with this knowledge, and we need you to come in and help people to learn to be reverent, and request that your priest be more reverent. If that's what you desire, but do it in charity. And there's such a lack of charity in the SSPX. It's It's like they're a bunch of children, and if they're not getting their way, then they're just going to stomp around, and actually that is exactly how the priests and the leadership act. And even in this, the latest, the crisis series, and John Salza debating and winning, he's just a winner, because every time he writes an article, it completely obliterates these SSPX apologists, and they're like, oh, ex-Freemason, Freemason. They don't even have, and they don't have any comebacks other than to attack John Salza personally, because he just completely blows them out of the water with his arguments, with his solid logic and church teaching.
Right.
And so I really wish people would see that. But again, it's like you have to factor in the emotional part of this for these people, because it's like they don't even try to think of it logically. It's like, no, they're wrong no matter what. Okay. I mean, most of them surround themselves in their echo chamber because in order to keep their fake utopia going, you can't hear anything that anybody else has to say.
Wow. Yeah, you can't threaten the idol, because it would be too hurtful to them to not have that to hold on to anymore.
And most of these people, they're good-willed. I mean, like I said, all of my family that's in there, I know they have good intentions. I know that they want to save their souls, and they want their kids' souls saved, and they don't but they won't even touch on. There's too much. I think they're too scared maybe to look outside, like, well, I don't know, like they don't want to have to make a decision, like a decision different from what they're doing, because it's their comfort zone, and they're so scared that if they leave, that they'll lose their soul. And
that's such a weird thing. I mean, traditionalists, especially in the SSPX, SSPV, like, they're ruined on everything else that's out there. It's like, if you can't make it in traditionalism and you leave, you're just going to go to be nothing, basically. Maybe not even believe there's a God, because they've done such a good job of telling you that you were in the one right place and everybody else was wrong, and there's nowhere else to go. But if you can't stand it anymore, and many people can't, then you just give it all up. That's so scary. That's like, wow. I mean, isn't the devil clicking his heels over that?
Oh, well, not only, I mean, there's that reason for giving it all up, but also there's the other reason that nobody's talking about. And we could do a whole show on this all by itself, which is these young kids who are being abused in the SSPX. And it totally scandalizes them. Of course, they see the hypocrisy. And then in so many cases, often the parents take the side of the SSPX, and so they don't prosecute. They don't press charges. They don't stand up for their child. Do you really think that child's going to remain Catholic or remain in your cult? Your fake Catholic cult? It's like, that's not going to happen. And so there's a huge, everybody goes, oh, the world, the flesh, and the devil, blame that on the loss of their soul, or the fact that, maybe they become homosexual, or they even go down the trans route, and it's like, no, these are hurt, broken souls who have been destroyed by men who consider themselves men of God. You expect them to keep the faith, besides the fact that they're not even taught the faith. They're taught a bunch of, word salads and phrases in the SSPX.
Yeah, right.
I mean, sorry if you feel my voice getting angry. I just, it's so maddening to me that there's such a lack of care of souls, and everybody's just ignoring it, like it's not there. You know?
Right. Like, this is enough. Where I'm comfortable enough where I'm at. Oh man, it made me think of this Sedevacantism site I was reading a little bit on the other day, and they were saying, kind of to like SSPXers and that say, like, well, I don't know about Sedevacantism. I don't think it's right, but I'm not a theologian, so it's it's not my place to get in and make determinations like that. I don't. I'm just going to be a simple person, just sit in the pews and be faithful. And their comeback to that was, well, you made yourself enough of a theologian and an expert to go sit in an SSPX pew. Like, you passed judgment on the whole rest of the church in order to be where you're at. And then you just drew the line and said, no further will I go. I've done enough, and this is good enough, and I just don't even need to think about those other things. And I thought, what a good point, because they're like, if you really were just being Joe Blow in the pew and being faithful and not getting involved, you'd be sitting in your nearest diocesan church and just doing your best where you were, instead of taking all the trouble to go somewhere else. Like, such a small sect, for one thing. I mean, most Catholics that I know don't even know it exists. Like, I talk to people about it and they're like, what? I had no clue that was even there. And it's like, they kind of, you know, I mean, because of the internet, they seem like a way bigger presence that they get around, but they're really tiny. And so, I mean, not like minorities can't do good or, you know, aren't legit, but it's just.
Well, they're a fairly loud minority online for sure. Some of the worst so-called Catholics on Twitter are SSPX. But and then there's still all these guys out there spreading misinformation. You know, Kennedy Hall is just a joke. And so so is, I mean, Joe, won't even go with Boga. I mean, the guy is silly, beyond silly. And then all these other people, you know, and they go after people like Michael Lofton who have legitimate arguments. And what do? They attack the person. They don't address his argument at all. And you're sitting here going, is that supposed to help your case?
Yeah,
you know,
that's a fallacy. It's like, dismantle the argument. We don't need to get personal. Yeah.
No, well, but that's all they have, because again, like, you know, they don't have an argument as far as like the magisterium backing up their position. And so, but I don't know. It's like, how do you bring people out of this blindness? Because it is a blindness. I haven't figured that out. I don't know. Other than prayer.
Prayer and you know, God's grace working in their souls the only way it can. I mean, it's such a mystery, and it's so interesting. I love hearing your story and anybody else that I meet or talk to. It's like, they're all so different. It's like, wow, look at how God worked in your life. It's just so unique to everybody, and you can't anticipate how that's going to turn out.
No. I mean, I would, if you would have asked me, you know, my 15-year-old self, if I would be in the church now, I would have said absolutely not, because it was definitely like the SSPX was the answer to me, to our salvation, to me. But also just realizing, I mean, the beauty, because I was still scared in the SSPX. Like, I always felt like this fear. And it's interesting because I would think often, like, you know, if I was called to be a martyr, like, could I? And that thought would scare me. And now that I'm in the church and I have the grace of the church, you know, because that's the other thing, right? Like, their masses are illicit. For 50 years, they're saying sacrilegious masses, and then they accuse the church of abuses. I mean, really?
Yeah.
You know, and you can't tell me that, you know, my husband always says, he uses this phrase constantly. He's like, you know, these guys, when people are like, well, no, they think they're doing the right thing. No, you're not allowed to be that stupid. You know, if you're a religious, if you're a priest, if you're a bishop, you're not allowed to be that stupid.
Yeah.
You know, you are leading souls to hell. They have no grace. You know, again, that's why, you know, everybody always says they hate the Pope. And they're constantly talking garbage about the Pope. But then when the Pope gave the society the faculties for marriage and confession after 40 plus years of illicit ones, they're like, oh no, see, the Pope gave us faculties. And it's like, well, but you hate the Pope. So now it's okay that, like, oh, use the Pope in defense of yourself. But it's like, no, actually, he didn't give them to you because you're well-behaved clerics. He gave them for the sake of the faithful, so that they can help save their souls. So they have the grace of the church on their marriage. And then in fact, my sister, come find out, even after that decree, They didn't get permission from the bishop for her marriage, so they still don't care. They don't care about souls. And so they, even though they could have the permission, they still don't care. It's like they just flip their nose at the bishops, you know.
Well, and it's so interesting. You mentioned something about, if I could just ask you about this, like liturgical abuse. Kind of talked about that a little bit, like how people will say, "Oh, the Latin Mass, it's intact, it's reverent, like you can't break it, you can't hurt it." But I mean, you've been a sacred musician pretty much like ever since you were old enough to, and so you've worked with a lot of different priests, and mostly in the TLM. I mean, until recently, and your husband was in seminary and stuff. I mean, can you speak to that at all? Like, how is that true? Like, are all priests just, like automatically reverent in their celebration of the Mass? Do they explain, why you do things? Do they follow the rubrics? Like, I mean, is that just a given like everybody says?
Honestly, I mean, the SSPX is like the Wild West. It really is. It's just every priest, like, this is when we would talk about this, even when we were like, full blown into the SSPX, is like, you could go to any different priest and get any different answer for whatever you want. If you get the wrong answer to your question 2 times, go to another priest. You're probably going to get the answer you want. It's like there was total lack of communication, no organization in that sense. Yeah. And yeah, like, there's Sedevacanist priests in the SSPX, it's like, they don't believe, we met several. And so it's just a mess. There's and my husband, when he went to seminary, I mean, he was a pretty naive farm boy, I think, when he went in, and he wasn't, he wasn't looking for red flags anywhere. And so, when I talked to him about it, he's like, I don't know, like there were priests that he had a hard time, he couldn't stand, but, and he always says, he goes, the thing is, like, going to the seminary made him realize that, there's just as many, just like priests can be a-holes just like anybody else, and so so he's like, if anything, I kind of lost respect for the priest in going to the seminary. But that may be the case for anybody that goes to any seminary. I don't know. But no, he didn't really notice anything like that. But there were definitely priests, that would just, they would do weird stuff. Like during the liturgy, there was one priest, it was like, he was so scrupulous that he would sit there at the consecration and just go, ha, 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 like for the word hoke. Like, what is going on right now? It always sounded so creepy and weird. Oh, no. And and then I know there were other priests that would just do rude stuff, but I mean, that's probably typical of anywhere, like possibly in the church. I mean, I find that my parish priest is just a loving, charitable man, and he really does care for souls. And I think that, like, some of these, weird things about these other priests, I mean, it could just be their strange, whatever, personalities. But no, there's definitely, like, there's no sense of cohesion or unity even amongst the priests, I don't think. Right.
Okay.
And in fact, if you're a good boy and you're like a good yes man, like you're going to go up the rank pretty quickly, as opposed to like some of these other priests that were just kind of did their own thing, and so we could always tell, like, a priest that was ordained and then 5 years later he's, or even, I don't know, some of them 2 years later are like, running a parish, and you're like, is this prudent? Because my husband, his uncle was a diocesan priest, and I mean, he went through like 12 years of seminary and then 10 years as a priest under another priest before he ever had his own parish.
Yeah, and I think ideally they have a lot more of a warm-up time, but when you're desperate,
Well, when you're desperate, but also, like, I just think it's sort of like rewarding the good boys. It's like, oh, well, he does whatever we say. And that's where that, that holy obedience, like, it's kind of laughable that they'd even use that word, like holy obedience,
right. Right. I'm curious if you could touch on this real quick. I don't want to keep you all day, I promise. About like scriptures in your growing up and the Bible, how was that represented or encouraged for you? Or like, has that anything in your relation or understanding of the scriptures changed since you came over?
Yeah. In fact, I actually read the scriptures now.
Oh, wow.
It was not something encouraged. And it could have been a familial thing, but I think actually it is kind of like the society, it doesn't encourage the reading of scriptures. And I've come to realize why. Both my sister and I, we've been doing the Bible in a year with Father Mike Schmitz, which is just amazing. And there's so much about obedience and how important that is to God. And we were not encouraged to read scripture. And other than the gospel and epistle and what was inside the mass, and unless you had they would go in the pulpit and say the gospel in English. But if you didn't have a missal and if you didn't understand Latin, then you couldn't really understand the rest. But generally people did have missals. But anyway, no, that's been an interesting thing in my life. It's been another like gift. It just feels like a gift. It's like you can read scripture and you can understand it, and it's just beautiful. And it's just this jewel in the church that I didn't have before,
That's so cool. I mean, it's such a new thing. I mean, it's like the three-legged table, the scriptures, tradition, and the magisterium. And it's like, well, where is the scripture in all this? Like,
right. Well, and where's tradition? Is it tradition to disobey the Pope for 50 years?
Yeah, right. I mean, Lefebvre called it the experiment of tradition, what he was doing. It's like, wait a second, experiment and tradition don't really go together. What's going on here?
Right. No, it's scary.
Yeah. I mean, before we kind of wrap up, well, there are a couple questions for you in the chat. I'll put those up on the screen in a minute, but I just wondered if there's any other kind of like poignant reflections or stories you'd like to share with us from just kind of going back over things and looking at them in a new light.
Oh boy. I mean, there's a lot. I'm trying to think
Part two. Man.
Yeah, I mean, really a person could. I guess I'm just really grateful at what happens. Like I think that as a child, a youngster, a teenager, and getting married, I've always wanted to make sure that I was doing the right thing. I was a good kid. I mean, well, probably not a good kid, but I was a fairly good teenager in that, like, I didn't go out and, I wasn't promiscuous, and I followed the rules basically, and I always have, and I've always been in my parents' good graces for the most part because of that. And I think that our Lord he's consoled me, because it's been really hard not to be in their graces anymore, and I think that's something that's okay for people to know, like, and realize like he's consoled me. Our consolation is in the church and in Christ. And so that's what we have to hang on to. And we can't, even if things are hurting us, like, we can't allow that to lead us to make our decisions, And so I don't know. I mean, if you're looking for different stories, I'd probably have to go through and like write something down, because there's so many in my head that it's hard to. But another thing that I do want to tell people who perhaps are struggling with this and who have children, and maybe they think that this is going to be really hard for their kids, the change, or maybe it would be bad for them. And all I can say is that, when our Lord tells us that we have to be like little children, like, there's a reason for that, like, kids are more wise than we are sometimes. And it was interesting because one of the first times that we attended. So I go to the Latin Novus Ordo mass every Sunday that our parish priest has. But occasionally I'll go to the Novus Ordo, and one of the first times I went to just a full English, because the Latin Novus Ordo is this 69, 70. It's just that it's more of it's in Latin, right? Is that
right
difference? And one of the first times I took them to a full English mass, and I was interested to see their reaction. So I told them beforehand, I said, this is just a full English mass, so everything is in the vernacular and no Latin. And the kids are like, okay, and we go into mass, and my little boy, he was 7 at the time, after we left church, he said, hey mama, you know what? I kind of like this one better because I actually understood what the priest was saying.
Oh, that's so cute. Oh man.
And it was cute. And it's like, they're fine. They're just absolutely fine with it. It's like, you just talk to your children, they totally understand it. And it's like less of a mystery to them than, or a change, or a whatever you want to call it, than it is to us as adults,
Right.
So,
well, you have all this PTSD and stuff. They haven't necessarily gotten involved in that. It's just kind of like whatever they're presented with, and then they sort of process it. Yeah.
I mean, they exactly. And I mean, again, like, if you're worried that somehow your kids are going to be scandalized by things, my advice is just, well, then talk to your kids. I mean, it's really just that simple. For these people that are like, oh, my kids would lose the faith. And it's like, well, your kids are losing the faith, and you brought them up in the SSPX. And so obviously that's not the answer, right? So maybe it's more that we need to, have discussions with our children and treat them like human beings, because there's a lot of families in the SSPX. I nannied and babysat a lot, and there was just a lot of abuse. There was a lot of sad stories that I saw. And not all of them. I mean, there's some happy families, but it's just like there's this sort of like harsh mentality kind of throughout. It's like, you're told from the time you're an infant, offer it up, just be quiet, just offer it up. There's not like where I saw the compassion and empathy lacking for the victims. It's kind of the same for children and families. And it's like they're told to be tough, just offer it up. And I'll never forget a lady that I went to babysit for, and I think I was probably 15 or so years old, and she was like 33 years old, and she had at least 10 kids by that time, and I think she had gotten married very early, like 16 or 17, and she looked like a zombie. Like her house, like she was just sitting there. She'd had child after child after child, because that's the other thing. It's like, oh, your job is to have children, your job is to have children. And so some of these women have a baby every year or every year and a half, and it just takes its toll. And there's like no respect for women and, their bodies. And so, it was one of the saddest things I ever experienced and seen. And then the other really sad thing was, like, the dad was just a tyrant. He came home that night, and if I had known this was going to happen, I wouldn't have told him anything. But he's like, "How are the kids?" And I was like, "Yeah, it was fine. There was like this kid did this and whatever." And I was just being honest. I thought he just wanted me to tell him.
Yeah,
and
report.
Report. And he ripped off his belt, and he went in, and it was 2 or 3 in the morning.
Oh,
and he ripped several of the kids out of bed and just started wailing on them. And he didn't explain anything to them. Like, wow. I mean, not that would have been okay either. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like I was horrified.
Wow.
And so and that the thing is that that's not that uncommon. I've talked to a lot of kids who were raised in the SSPX, and their childhood was pretty harsh and pretty rough. And it's like, you're just taught to like suck it up and offer it up, and so the joy and the love is totally missing there too. And it's like, again, do you think that your kids are going to keep the faith?
Right. Yeah, without the warmth of charity, there's nothing. Yeah, you're just going to grow cold. It's like that Christianity, you can't separate that. It's all about love. I mean, not to sound hippie, but it's like,
it is. This is that is exactly, like, again, this is like a jewel that has come into my life. It's like, you don't have to be like so intense. You don't have to be so harsh. You don't have to, because there's a lot of like Puritanism in the SSPX. Tons of people are really just Puritans, and they're that was the other thing. They almost put more stock in private revelation than in scripture and the magisterium, and so there's just a lot of like what do I want to say, like not, well, yes, children are scrupulous, but I was going to say, like, we were talking about a little bit earlier when you said that about the scapular. It's more like a superstition,
Yeah.
And it's like this fear of these things that keep you in line, rather than love, rather than feeling love.
As I sit here wearing one. Oh! Well, which is like, the scapular is awesome, but when you start making like too much emphasis on these things, like it's so legalistic and it's so pharisaical, and it's like, you better do this or that. Like, God isn't going to consider your heart. Like, if you forgot to put your scapular back on after the shower or something, and my husband and I call that being Catholic naked, when you forget to put your scapular back on after you get out of the shower. I mean, I wear mine in the shower, but he doesn't. But it's like, he puts it right back on after. But one day, like, he went to work and he forgot to put it back on after his shower, and I found it, and I was like, oh shoot, he didn't have his scapular on. Oh man, I hope nothing happens. And then I was like, calm down. Like, I'm a Pharisee, okay? I definitely tend to that. And I'm just like, if he gets smeared on the side of the road, Our Lady knows that in his heart, he would totally have it on every minute. He never stops being her son. He never wanted to give it up. It's like, yeah, but I can see why people would kind of have like this pushback from that. Like, man, I almost just need some space to sort of rediscover these
especially things. Children, right? Because that's extreme. That's just really extreme. And so living in fear your whole childhood, one of my sister-in-laws who has also come into the church, another brother and sister-in-law, she told me, she's like, I just saw God as this scary, angry person, all my life.
No.
And so is that what the church wants? Of course not.
Yeah.
And is it any wonder then that some of these people, these children are leaving, they either come to a point where it's like, you know what, I'm not going to live in fear anymore. And so I'm going to just let all of this go. And then, like you said, they just completely leave.
Yeah.
Or they just kind of continue to live in fear, and they continue to be kind of scrupulous. And it's a big problem. It's a big problem.
Another friend of mine who left the society, she was telling me about like how the priests would preach. They would tell these stories and stuff. Like, they definitely obviously wanted to instill fear in people to keep them doing or not doing certain things. Like this story about this guy, I don't remember where the story came from, but it was a true story about this guy that was taught by his mother to pray the 3 Hail Marys every morning and every night. And he eventually left the faith and was living a life of sin and stuff. And one night but he would always say his 3 Hail Marys just because his mom taught him to. And then like this one night he like had this dream like this bad dream, and he woke up, and I'm probably not remembering this totally right, but there was like, there's like this black monkey under his bed, and he's like, what is that thing doing there? And like Our Lady appeared to him and said, like, this is a devil that has been following you around while you live your sinful life. And if you hadn't said your 3 Hail Marys just one time, he was going to strangle you to death and take you to hell. She's like, so this priest told this story from the pulpit, and she's a kid sitting there going, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And she just like had such terror about stuff like this. Like, this is true, and the priest is telling me I've got it. And I was just like, oh my gosh. I mean, like, the fear of the Lord is a good thing, but fear is like the beginning. You're supposed to, perfect love casts out all fear.
It kind of makes you wonder, like, did they just make these stories up to scare little children?
I've read some pretty amazing stories like that in books. I'm like, wow, it must be true, but holy cow, I'm not going to be telling my kids that, as the motivation.
Right. It's like, again, what are we trying to accomplish here? When we're talking about little children, like, when you can't go wrong in showing them the love of Christ. You can't. You can't overlove a child, and so show them that. There's a reason, again, scrupulous people. I'm in contact, like I said, with a lot of like ex-SSPX kids. They're not kids anymore, but young adults. And that seems to be the main theme, is that they're scrupulous beyond belief. And it's just sad. It's so sad that they were scared into being good. Or obviously not all of them were, right? Because some of them rebelled against that. But it's just sad. It's just a sad thing. So there's a lot of problems. We could go on and on days.
Oh man, I know. But I do want to get this one fellow put up a question for you. I'm going to put it up here on the Anastasia. How did you help your husband through this? My wife is still set on Sedevacantism. There's a lot of deprogramming I need help with.
That's interesting. Yeah, it wasn't that hard because, Matt, he wasn't a Sedevacanist to begin with. And I think it actually is very tricky to get Sedevacanist, to pull Sedevacanist, because in fact, I think that there's less of a contradiction in Sedevacanism, even though it's wrong. There's still less of a contradiction than in the SSPX, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right.
At least they're, they follow their convictions, right? Like, there is no pope. So it's like they're not disobeying a pope because there is no pope, as opposed to the SSPX. Yes, we believe he's the pope, but we're going to disobey him for 50 years, And so I, obviously prayer, first of all. But honestly, one of the best things I could suggest to ZZZZ, I guess, is that he just go to the True or False Pope website, because John Salza specifically goes after the Sedevacanist position as well, and very thoroughly debunks it, based on the magisterium.
I don't know if also there's a website, I don't know if you've seen this, Anastasia, but I totally cannot find out who the author is, but he posts really good stuff. It's called contrasedevacantism.blogspot.com, I think. If you just look up Contrasedevacantism, and he's written a book that he just put online, people can download. Again, no author attribution, so I have no idea who's doing this, but it's called A Definitive Refutation of Sedevacantism, and I'm hoping I will have enough time to do audio recordings of that whole book and put it on my YouTube channel so people can just listen to it. Because I'm like, anything I've read by him, like his blog posts and articles, they are super scholarly, thorough, and it can be debunked because it's an error. So it totally can't be. And True or False Pope, that book that John Salza and his friend, I don't remember his name, they wrote, John Cisco, I think, together. Yeah, that's another.
Robert Cisco, I believe. Yeah.
Robert Cisco. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and that book is because they were, John was attending the SSPX at the time. They endorsed that book, the SSPX.
Oh, yeah.
Great book. It totally blows Sedevacantism out of the water. It's like, and it blows you out of the water too. But we won't talk about that. Also, holy water on the pillow at night. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, back to this fellow's question, I really, because my husband, he was a reader back in the day, but he's just so busy, just working, and we're busy after he comes home from work, and so he just doesn't have the time to read. And so I would read things, and then I would just talk to him about it. And so perhaps you could do that, instead of just sending her articles to read, maybe it would be better if you read the article and then you remember certain points and then you just bring it up to her as if it's interesting. I don't know if there's contention between this conversation between you two, so I can't necessarily speak to that, but that's what I did with my husband a lot. And and he would just like, it would kind of blow his mind, and then sometimes he'd want to know more, and then I would send him a video, a super interesting video that I had found or something. But it's kind of like, and the thing is that he wasn't that far behind me, and so I was blessed in that way, because I know that certain people are way further, certain spouses are a lot further behind, and it's harder to convince them. But yeah, I mean, just keep working at it, and just having like, calm conversations about it, because obviously you both, want to help each other save your souls.
Oh, he added in, ZZZZ added in some more. He said his wife's not a totalist, though, and that's mostly what Saul's he only really deals with totalism in the book. And
I see.
Yeah, but I would check out that the definitive refutation of Sedevacantism. I will try to post that in the description of the video after this is all done broadcasting, so people can find that link to the book and see if that might dig into some more. He's got a really thorough table of contents too, so you might even be able to just find like things that you're looking for specifically and get that.
Right.
Also, we had just a bunch of appreciation of you just sharing your story in the chat. And because, let's see, Hallelujah says, not so much a question. I'm so glad Anastasia has been able to speak out and tell us her story. And then she asks, is there a support group for people leaving the SSPX or Sedevacantism?
Oh, well, thank you, Haley. Hallelujah. Oh, hallelujah. Oh, that's cool.
I love that.
All right. So the support group that I started was specifically for sex abuse survivors of the SSPX, actually. Maybe there are some groups out there for people leaving the SSPX. I've never even gone to look.
I've never heard of one, but there should be.
Yeah, there should be, because it is good to talk to other people who have are experiencing the same things, did experience the same sort of childhood, and just be able to use them as a sounding board and somebody that can relate to you, because oftentimes you're talking to people. I have found that when I'm speaking to just somebody in our parish, and it's kind of interesting because they'd like to know your story or whatever, and I tell everybody, we came from the SSPX cult, please don't even ever consider it. Like, it's just it's terrible, it's a nightmare, don't even go there. And so I'm very open about the fact that I come from there. And then you're telling people these stories, and their eyes just keep getting wider and wider, and in disbelief, right? And so like, this was normal for you, and they just can't even believe it.
Yeah.
It's like, what kind of world is this?
Yeah.
But if you're coming out of a cult, like, that's all you know. And so many people like, oh, it is not a cult. It hits every single definition of a cult. Yes, it does. So, and the fact that these children coming out of it, people coming out of it are so broken is another indication.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, there's definitely more of a need. I feel like there's more information out there now than ever about how to debunk this stuff, or just specifically why it's wrong, and just putting this in people's hands easily. Like the Logos Project has been posting a lot of stuff, and I know that Dom is really happy to talk to people if they reach out to him. Andrew Bartel, the same thing. So if you can contact them through YouTube, I mean, they might even know people who would start something like this, or add that as an extension of what they do.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I don't see any other questions, so I guess maybe we can dry it up.
Oh boy.
Try it anyway. Oh man, I appreciate so much you giving your time, Anastasia. It's so generous. I know you have a lot going on, but
it's okay. I told my children, I was like, I need silence for a few hours. Stay downstairs and don't come knocking.
Yeah, right.
I will come down and you dinner.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much. And everybody who's watching, thank you for tuning in, and share with your friends. And I just saw a comment that said, I hope you clip this into small segments for more people to listen to. So I'll see what I can do about that, because I know a 2.5-hour video is very daunting to watch, but at least you can come back later and it'll pick up where you left off. So for now we can do that. But yeah, so thank you again, Anastasia. God bless you.
Thank you, Maura. God bless you
Sure.
too. All right.
All right. Well, we will talk to you another time.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Bye.